Greetings and welcome to this online lecture series on a revolutionary new way of reading the Bible. Developed by Eugen Drewermann, an internationally best-selling author of more than 100 books. Today we will look at the first so-called miracle story that is reported in the Gospel of Mark. And we will follow Drewermann as he interprets this story in a way that leaves it not in the far distant past as sort of like a magic story where Jesus applied some magic, but rather as a story in which experiences happen that connect very closely to our own experiences. And that is actually what makes Drewermann's method so revolutionary, that he argues we can only understand texts like these if we find experiences in ourselves that are related to the experiences that are portrayed in these stories. Now, I want to briefly, before we go into the story and the way Drewermann interprets this, I want to briefly think with you about how this is even possible that we are able to read a story from 2,000 years ago and that we are able to apply it to ourselves. So here is an important aspect of Drewermann's method of understanding that differs from traditional ways of understanding biblical stories as kind of past stories. Drewermann argues that we are only able to understand stories like this because we have in ourselves certain structures that allow us to comprehend even a story like this. And so if you think about what faculties, what capabilities are you having in yourselves when you read stories, let's say, from the long distant past of, let's say, the Gilgamesh epic, or the stories that Plato talks about. For instance, the story that Plato tells about people in a cave seeing shadows. How is it possible that we are able today to comprehend stories like this? What is in our mind that allows us to comprehend these stories? So one of the things that obviously is in our mind is that we are able to think, just like people back then are able to think. We have reason, we have abilities to draw conclusions, to draw inferences. And so there are cognitive abilities we have. But Drewermann argues that for religious stories or for spiritual stories, it is absolutely important that we take into account that we have image creating capabilities in our psyche, that we have abilities in our psyche that connect us with the imagery that is portrayed in these healing stories or in any mythical stories, really. And we will actually next week take a look at the whole question about the relationship between myth and our historical existence. And we'll touch a little bit on that today, but next week we will look at this in more detail because one of the biggest questions that early Christians were faced with was that they were told, well, you know, your stories sound very similar to the stories that we have in many other communities in so-called, what Christians later called pagan communities. They were talking about stories of a son of God. They were talking about miracle workers. They were talking about healing stories. And so, or death and resurrection even. And so part of the question that the early Christians were asked, well, what is it that makes your stories unique? And so what they argued is that these stories that are myth in other communities and other traditions, that these are stories that in Christianity have really historically happened. So in Jesus, all of this really happened. He really walked on the water. He really multiplied bread and so on. And so when the early Christian folks did this, they thought, okay, so we're kind of out-trumping the other miracle stories that are in communities that are not following Jesus. Now, of course, this created, after the so-called Enlightenment in our Western societies, quite a problem, because we are not able to see that people are physically walking on the water, or that you can multiply bread miraculously and then this way eradicate hunger. And so many people have become disenchanted with these kinds of stories. And this, in fact, has led to atheism. Beginning in the mid-19th century, atheism kind of developed, partly because people realized, well, these stories are really not stories about physical external things that break through natural laws and so on. And so this led to a crisis of faith. And in fact, this is actually something that is still going on today. Many people are turning their back against religion because they don't believe that the way that religious institutions have asked them to just suspend their reason and to sacrifice their cognitive abilities, their rational abilities, and just give it up and say, well, we'll just believe that God can do this. Now, this is, to this day, though, the kind of sacrifice that many religious communities ask of people in order to call themselves Christians or believers. Drewermann argues that this is a very harmful way of misinterpreting religious stories, and that this actually does injustice to these stories, because this is not at all what these stories wanted to communicate. And stories like the story that we're hearing about today are not magical stories that suspend natural laws, that break natural laws. Instead, what these stories are is they're stories that break our ways of life, that basically turn our lives upside down, lives that are in despair, lives that are caught in obsessive compulsive ruminations, lives that are basically just following the herd instinct, that are part of groupthink. And so this is what the story that we're going to talk about today exemplifies. So these image creating layers of our psyche are key to our capabilities of understanding these stories in the first place. Now, Drewermann acknowledges that Sigmund Freud and Carl Gustav Jung are the ones who really helped us first listen to these capabilities by going into our dreams, by helping us stay connected to our psyche, and by listening very carefully to ourselves, by listening to our dreams, by listening to what's going on in our psyche. And so Sigmund Freud looked at this very much in terms of our immediate personal upbringing, our internalizations of other people's ideas, beliefs, voices. Whereas Carl Gustav Jung argued that these image creating layers, these dream creating layers of our psyche. And every night you can yourselves be able to notice, if you remember your dreams, that we are creating images. And it is those image creating layers that make up the stuff of Shakespeare or of many other writers, of novelists and so on. Now, Carl Gustav Jung argued that these image creating layers have a much longer history than just our personal life. Instead, they have a long evolutionary history, that in fact they were formed as we, as human beings, developed as part of nature. And so we are, for instance, having the image of trees in our psyche because we grew up around trees. And so in the image of a tree that our psyche can form, a lot of the evolutionary experiences from our past are connected. So for instance, a tree served us in our evolutionary past very similarly as it still today functions for many animals, for many primates, but also for, if you just look outside and you see a squirrel run away from what the squirrel perceives to be a predator, the squirrel will see the tree as the place where there is safety, where there is protection, where there is rescue. And so therefore, trees have for us evolutionary and affectively the significance of potentially a place where we can find rescue. And that is one of the reasons Jung, for instance, argued that the cross, the wooden cross, was connected in the human imagination, had such a big impact in human history as a symbol for salvation, or for really protection from evil, from harm. Now, this is something that we will go into actually later when we look at the whole so-called passion narrative, the narrative of the suffering of Jesus, of the crucifixion, so on. This is not the topic for us today, but we will get into this actually as we get closer to Easter. What I want to emphasize just now is that we have these image creating layers of our psyche that are evolutionarily rooted. And Drewermann says that in order to avoid from using these ideas as just in a speculative way, and so that we kind of randomly associate images in ways that are open to just random speculation that would get away from our affective experience, he suggests that we would deepen our understanding of the images, or as Carl Gustav Jung called it, the archetypes, these images that are evolutionary based and that we all as humans carry with us. Drewermann argues that we should deepen this through ethological research, that is the research of animal and human behavior. So for instance, the behavior that a squirrel experiences, or when we look at how birds are, or how animals are able, just from the shadow on the ground, to perceive that a certain bird is a predator. These are things that they're not like taught by their by the parents of these animals, but these are imprinted images in our psyche. And so similarly, we have certain images imprinted upon us. Now, so we have the cognitive capabilities, we have the image creating capabilities, but then Drewermann adds we have a third capability, and that is the relational capability, the capability of feeling either trust or fear in relation to others. This is very significant because Drewermann has been sometimes misunderstood as being primarily a Jungian. Now he dips very much into the Jungian kind of psychology, but some of the books that have explicated Drewermann's work in English, for instance, this book, Psychology and the Bible, A New Way to Read the Scripture, mentions Drewermann quite a bit, and usually mentions Drewermann's work as a work that is seeing biblical stories through the lens of archetypes. Now, there's some truth to that in terms of getting to the affective layer of the images that are in these stories. Another book that is more recent is this book, Psychological Hermeneutics for Biblical Themes and Texts. This was a festschrift in honor of Wayne Rollins, one of the pioneers in studying the Bible psychologically. One of his books that I have already mentioned in a previous lecture is this book, Soul and Psyche, which gives a very nice introduction to the psychological perspectives on reading the Bible. But I want to emphasize here the third dimension that Drewermann says is key in understanding how we have capabilities that even understand stories, not just like the Bible, but also plays from Shakespeare and so on, or from Goethe, or from many other writers. And that is the relational capability. Now, why is that so important? This is actually key to Drewermann. The reason why this is so important is because depending on the way we feel in relationship to another human being or in relationship to a group of other people, depending on how we experience that, we experience both our reason and our imagining capabilities in certain ways, namely either in ways that lead us to trust ourselves or to fear ourselves, to read these stories as stories that potentially demonize us or that help us gain trust in ourselves and in the relationships that we have. So this is so important because a story like ours today can easily be misused to actually instill fear and to demonize people rather than to help people calm the voices that demonize them inside. And so what I'm talking about here has been fairly well described in a book that is titled The Vatican Exorcists. In that book, a journalist investigates the rise of exorcism in the Vatican. Yes, you hear this correctly, in the Vatican. There has been a large proliferation since John Paul II, Pope John Paul II, of the practice of exorcism. You would think that this is something of the far distant, maybe medieval past, but no, John Paul II revived this practice. And in the Vatican, an entire office has been established that deals with exorcisms. And there are exorcists that have proliferated all over the world, over 30,000. And so what those so-called exorcists do, they read these stories very literally, and then they basically create the very symptoms that they're trying to then exorcise. You can only understand this proliferation of exorcism if you understand that the alienation of people from themselves and the fragmentation of people from themselves has been produced by the literalism of the stories in the first place. So when you instill fear of the devil in people from childhood on, and then you tell people that only the church can save you from it, then these kinds of ideas are used by people to talk about when they actually are alienated, but this is from themselves, and when they're actually oppressed by other people, including by the church, but this is not seen in this way. Instead, the evil is projected into a so-called devil figure that is seen as a being outside, rather than that we understand that all of this so-called demon possession is really something much more human, and that it has to do with the destruction of the spirit of this particular person through a system of religion and spirituality that is basically depersonalizing them, and that has destroyed their ability to hold on to themselves. And so this practice of exorcism only maintains this particular thing. And in the book, The Wedding Exorcist, you actually can read how many of these practices are keeping people dependent in these forms of exorcism, so that they have to keep having exorcists. And so this caste of exorcists can continue to exist. So this relational ability is a very key experience. And so for that, Drewermann argues, we have to understand that our ability to relate has a lot to do with our sense of self. We experience our sense of self always in relation to another person. From the time we are little children, we are aware that we are seen by another person. And that can be a very great thing that can instill self-esteem in us if we are seen by another person in a way that we're loved, that we're wanted in our own way, as our own person. Then we develop in us a confidence in our own personhood. Then we develop in ourselves the sense that we are loved, that we are meaningful, that we matter. But if we experience as children that we are constantly being questioned, that we're being persecuted in a way, that we are not supposed to exist, or that we're taking up space that we shouldn't take up, that we're too much for a caregiver, then we can develop anxieties in ourselves. We can develop a very fragile sense of self. Now, here's the important thing. Drewermann argues that even if we have had very positive experiences growing up, there comes a point in the self-awareness of each of us when we are not just thinking about, well, how do other people see us and see ourselves, and how do we see ourselves in response to our other people see us, but also that we realize that we are finite human beings, and that we are reflecting on that ability, that on that reality, that we do not have a absolute firm ground under our feet. And when that happens, when we become self-aware, when we wonder what we will do with the few years we have on this planet, and that we are facing our certain death at some point, then our self-reflective awareness gets much more heightened if we let that really sink in. And then a new fear appears that is not just created by what other people think about us, but by the very question, well, what is our meaning? What is the significance of our existence, period? And so the existentialists, existential philosophers, they looked in detail at all the experiences that relate to this kind of self-experience. They talked about the abyss that opens up when we become self-aware, and that we on some level are looking for some ground to stand on. And so this anxiety is something that comes up, and Drewermann argues that in religion, this anxiety is actually the main focal point, or in spirituality, if you think of Buddhism, Buddhism talks a lot about not attaching oneself to the appearances of things, to that which really perishes, that which is not lasting, and not to confuse ourselves with that. Because if we hang ourselves on this, then we suffer in a particular ways. And so the end of suffering is thought to lie in not attaching ourselves to these false securities. There's something very similar happening in the Gospels, Drewermann argues, that Jesus actually also dealt with this form of suffering. But what Jesus tried to do is he tried to show how a certain form of religion, a certain type of religiosity can be used to give us the illusion of calming the existential fear while actually oppressing us through that very form of religion. And it is very important at this point to emphasize that this is a form of religion that exists in every religion. This is a type of religiosity that we find in all religions. We find this in Christianity, we find this in Islam, we find this in Judaism, we find this in all forms of religion where the legalistic mindset prevails, and where we tie people to obeying certain religious rules, certain rituals, and we tell them, if only you do that, then you'll be saved, or then you will be loved by God, or then God will look favorably on you, meaning that basically then you will have some absolute significance. And this is the point where we are joining the story today. The first healing story in the Gospel of Mark happens exactly around this kind of mindset. And Drewermann argues that we cannot understand what the language of evil spirits means unless we understand the kind of spirit that a legalistic form of religiosity that exists in every form of religion does to a person, the kind of depersonalization that happens. And so the casting out of evil spirits is not some magic of driving out certain supernatural voices out there. It is actually about healing a form of religiosity that is depersonalizing people, that makes them feel that they're unclean in themselves, that they're impure because they're not able to be perfect followers of a certain form of legalistic religion. So this is the backdrop. These are the capabilities, the cognitive abilities, the image creating capabilities, and the relational capability that are relational between people, but that also are relational in terms of us having a relationship with ourselves, our self-reflective relationality. And so based on this, let us now take a look at the story. And I will again read the story here and then make comments along the way as Drewermann interprets this. So this story is found in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 1, verses 21 through 28. And it is usually called the healing of the possessed in Capernaum. And so you already have heard through my introduction what kind of possession we have to have in mind. You can very much think of this kind of possession in a way like a colonialization of a person's spirit. And so there is very much in this story that also so-called post-colonial theorists are making of today, that in social forms there can also be this colonialism, and so this story can be read in this way. But what Drewermann does is he goes a step further and looks at how our own spirit, our own mind can be colonized, how our own mind can be stolen, robbed from us, so that we are not possessing ourselves, that we are not in charge of ourselves, that we are not owners ourselves, but rather that we are basically owned by other people's opinions, by the they, by the minds of others. And we have dystopian novels in which we hear about this, whether it has been George Orwell's 1984 or The Hunger Games, many other stories where you can draw similarities to what we're about to hear here. So this is the story, beginning in chapter 1 of the Gospel of Mark, verse 21. That is how they enter Capernaum. They meaning Jesus and those who are walking with him, that are usually called his disciples or his followers. And right away on the Sabbath, stepping into the synagogue, he, meaning Jesus, began teaching. Then they were besides themselves because of his teaching. Now this is the crowd and the people that are listening to him. For he, as their teacher, was one possessing authority, not like the scribes. One who was possessing authority. So he was in ownership of himself. Then verse 23, for immediately there, for instance, now we are seeing an illustration of what this authority looks like. There was in their synagogue a man in an unclean spirit. He cried out, saying, what do we have to do with you, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God. But Jesus rebuked him, saying, be silent and come out of him. And the unclean spirit, throwing him into convulsions and crying out with a loud howl, came out of him. Then all were stunned, so that they kept on debating among themselves, saying, "What is this? A new teaching with authority? He even commands the unclean spirits, and they obey him." And the news of him went out immediately everywhere into all of the region of Galilee. And here's Drewermann's interpretation. We can probably best know a religion by how much change it effects in humans when it speaks of God. The issue at stake here is never without risk. There's a way of settling down into life in which religion forms only a delimited part of life, a well-ordered, well-managed section of existence, seemingly causing neither harm nor apparent benefit, while in reality it leaves out, avoids, or at least does not penetrate from within whole parts of the human soul and of public life. It must be just this type of religion that Jesus found most distressing. A religion of scriptural learnedness that is isolated from real life experience. Such a religion is handed down through the fear of authorities who administer its sacred writings. It lives in the shadowy existence of a certain role within the ideological self-justification of bourgeoisie society, or within the distribution of power in the political public sphere. Just as an aside here, if you can just think of how much religion is currently used in the culture wars just here in the United States, but not just in the United States, all over the world really, and how this is used for political purposes to possess people, to control their bodies and their minds, and to reduce freedom of speech, to even reduce academic freedom. I record these lectures in Indiana, and in Indiana, there's right now a bill that is being discussed in the Indiana Senate that would prohibit teachers in schools from talking about things that make certain people uncomfortable. Things like racism, things that talk about how slavery was done and who the slave owners were. One wants to prohibit teachers from talking about this because certain students who are descendants of slave owners, for instance, would feel uncomfortable by that. And a lot of this is done in the name of religion. Those who are pushing laws like this are trying to use legalistic means to really curtail the free spirit of inquiry. And it is done in the name of God by many of those folks. So this is just an example of how this can be illustrated, and it's very current in our current societal discourse. I will continue now with Drewermann's interpretation here. But it does not have the power, meaning this kind of religion, to renew people. Indeed, if one takes this gospel of the healing of the possessed person as at its word, then it is even in danger, meaning this type of religion is in danger of being a henchman of evil itself. For the splitting into inside and outside, God and world, time and eternity, is not good for people. And whoever prevents people from living whole denies them to live at all. What Drewermann is talking about here, for instance, that this whole idea of demons and so on is something that is actually projected into the outside, as if it comes from outside. And this is a worldview that none of the people that actually are holding these worldviews today live in their everyday life. They use electricity, they fly, and they don't look at the world as a flat surface, but they want to maintain a worldview in which the devil is basically up there or down there in hell. And so there is this idea that what these stories talk about is outside, rather than seeing that these stories are actually talking about something inside, a struggle for life and death, for whether one can believe that one has absolute value or is totally meaningless, and so on. So I'll continue. When the New Testament speaks of demons, we often think we know what is meant by using the dogmatic word devil for it. But in this way, the reality of the demonic in the New Testament is not actually understood. Therefore, it is perhaps best to let the picture of this man's illness in the synagogue of Capernaum first affect us. So think about how this story will affects you. We then understand more profoundly what power evil can have in the human heart, and conversely, what power religion should have to lead humans back to God against all inner and outer resistances. Now, I want to say here, as I've said in other lectures before, when we hear the word God, many of us will bristle and like, oh my goodness, can you really talk about God in a way that is not alienating people in the first place as well? But this is partly the reason, this is partly because religion has itself talked of God in ways that are demonic. And so many people today turn their backs against even the belief in God because such a God is no longer credible. And so that because such a God is heteronomous, such a God wants to control people. This has nothing to do with the God of Jesus that Drewermann helps us understand here. I will continue. We can imagine many things by a demon that is unclean. In the case of the sickness of the soul of this man in this story, we for sure need to think about a person who suffers deeply from himself and who feels at the mercy and left to any kind of psychological bondage. In such a person, there is a compulsion to feel differently, to think differently, to speak differently, to act differently from what he himself actually wants. And the terrible secret of his life will lie in the fact that his own person must seem to him as if distorted, as if besieged, literally as if possessed. The uncleanness of this demonic possession may appear to those around him through the fact that he himself does not dare to have any real contact with others, that he does things which literally appear to them as not kosher, and that he himself must feel compelled to constantly play the role of an untouchable, an asocial, a pariah. One avoids him and pushes him away. One controls him like an animal in a fenced gate. One never admits him into the community of others as an equal, very much as if one should be ashamed even to be seen near him, as if one sullied oneself through any contact with him. But the worst thing is that he will feel like this himself, as too wicked, as too degenerate, literally as too impure to dare to be seen by others and impose his presence on them. To some extent, we have learned through depth psychology to understand how such states of the soul become possible and what happens so that a person ceases to live as themselves and instead keeps just spinning and moving within the same vicious circles of anxiety and self-hatred, self-rejection, and loneliness. And when Drewermann references depth psychology here, we have to think of Freud's psychoanalysis, of Carl Gustav Jung's analytical psychology, but also Drewermann talks in some of his books of other forms of depth psychology, for instance, Heinz Kohut's self-psychology, or of object relations theory by Donald Winnicott or Melanie Klein or Ronald Fairbairn, or many other current writers as well, and also of attachment theory, which grew out of psychoanalytic thinking. So you have to keep all of this in mind as you think about this. Also relational psychoanalysis and neuropsychoanalysis. There are many forms to depth psychology. Let me continue Drewermann's interpretation here. Active in the background of such felt experience are almost always strong formative forces that assured already in childhood that a person cannot grow up right, that she never is allowed to choose herself. Indeed, that she is systematically prevented from living what could live in her. We need to imagine the course of such an illness as clearly as possible. A child has certain feelings that meet with opposition from those around her. Such a conflict is in itself quite normal, but the question is how parents react to it. It is possible to tell a child that she cannot achieve this or that in the way she imagines. But one can also simply forbid a child to have certain feelings at all. In the latter case, the child will learn to be increasingly afraid of what are actually very natural impulses. She will first fear the parent's punishment and then fear herself. Eventually, she will begin to demonize herself for still having certain feelings, certain impulses within herself. And from that moment on, the so-called demonic possession will begin. The automatic process of soul destruction, the mechanism of internalized anxiety. In the end, one does not even know for which feelings and specific desires one demonizes, avoids, and hates oneself. All one eventually knows is that one deserves to be hated and demonized. That is, that one is a monstrosity. One comes to believe that one is not actually a human being, but rather a half-animal, hybrid creature, a minotaur. Drewermann has a footnote here that references that Pablo Picasso rediscovered this symbol of a minotaur as a symbol for the present human being. Hidden somewhere in the underground labyrinth of a royal castle, a deadly danger to anyone who dares to come near. A person who experiences himself in this fashion is accurately called unclean in the New Testament, because everything that could distinguish him as a human being has been poisoned in him since childhood with the arsenic of anxiety. He or she was developing as a boy or girl, hence as a sexual being, but was made to feel unclean because dangerous, seductive, sinful, demonic. Or they grew up and wanted to think for themselves, but this again was considered to be rebellious, dangerous, sinister, threatening, in other words, as sinful, as diabolical. Any person pressured by anxiety can be brought to the point where everything that could be beautiful and great in them ends up being driven out of them. But the spirit of a person is not empty, and the expelled, repressed contents of experience eventually deform into thoughts that no longer release the person, and they all speak their own language, ever more meaningless, ever more mechanical, ever more monotonous. I'm reminded here in this book, The Vatican Exorcists, that the author also interviewed psychiatrists, therapists, and so on, and many of them pointed out that the pattern in these so-called exorcisms suggests that a lot of what is going on there actually has to do with dissociative identity disorder. Now, if we listen to Drewermann here, we hear how Drewermann touches on this fragmentation of the self and of a person really only living through the voices of others. This is not just something that happens in dissociative identity disorder, though, Drewermann argues, but this is something that is the everyday normality of our life today. We all are trained to think basically through the thoughts of others. We are trained to think what is acceptable and what not, in a way that makes us depart from ourselves, that leaves us behind, and that represses significant parts of ourselves. Not just antisocial parts, but actually our very true selves. Let's go back to Drewermann's interpretation here. Only against this background, namely that the spirit is not empty, but it just has been completely distorted. Do we understand how this man in this story cries out in the synagogue of Capernaum, and yet does not get a single personal word past his lips? Instead, he shouts at Jesus to leave him alone in a collective voice, as if he were carrying an entire armada of opposing forces, powers and forces within himself, all of which can emerge only as a closed formation. He, the Holy One of God, should not upset and disturb his unholy rest. I say this again. He, the Holy One of God, should not upset and disturb his unholy rest, meaning this man's unholy rest. He should let him, the man, and his entire world be as they are. It is a terrible plea that begs only for permission to continue to live the non-life lived so far, and not to be forced out of the monstrum of one's personal non-existence. But what else can someone ask for who has never been allowed to be herself, other than basically for confirmation and recognition of her life in the collective only? This may even be the most common form in which the destruction of what is human presents itself. Now you see how Drewermann recognizes in this story not just a rarity of some story in the past, of some magic story, but as perhaps the most common form in which the destruction of what is human presents itself in all of us. At any rate, in our days, it is the most visible one. The depersonalization of the individual through the pressure to conform to collective phrases. Time and again, we experience this on a small as well as a large scale. Just when we could and would want to speak about ourselves most personally, most subjectively, most passionately, because for once our own feelings and thoughts would be meant and asked for, just at such a moment, fear sets in and shifts the language away from us to others. In the end, one only gets lost in general phrases. How one does this and that, what one must do in this and that case. In short, what others would say on any topic and what one should therefore also have to say. Such cases always suggest that it is just this style of dealing with each other that brings the bewitchment of the souls, the demonic possession of the spirits to earth, to the point that one is no longer at all interested in what kind of person one is dealing with. In the end, no sense of no I dares to emerge and express itself in speech. Rather, one constantly entrenches oneself behind the language of everyone. If we only listen closely, we can see that this language of impersonality and alienation is the language we usually use to communicate with each other. Playing hide and seek in generalities, indulging in figures of speech, constantly avoiding of each other as individuals. Behind everything we say lurks the terrible army of fear. At this point, it is absolutely crucial that Jesus does not tolerate any form of religion which, through spiritual impotence or convenient pseudo-reassurance, would sanction the existence of such zones of inhumanity as in this possessed man. At Jesus' very first appearance in the synagogue of Capernaum, we witness this absolute either-or stance through which he wants that we ourselves drop the masks of the collective camouflage. Through the eyes of Jesus, it is not an option to hand over a human being like a trained animal into the captivity of his anxieties and let him be at the mercy of them. Anyone who proclaims that the realm of God is near us cannot tolerate that humans must live on earth as if in hell. They judge its credibility based on the extent to which people can be given back to God in their freedom, in their beauty, in their irreplaceability of their person. No matter how vehemently the possessed person protests, Jesus must try to overcome his resistance to a possible healing. The event that takes place in this scene in the synagogue of Capernaum will have to be imagined in our everyday life as something that can usually take years as a process in which people are torn between anxiety and hope, quite literally as Mark describes it. A constant push and pull between the intimidations in which we grew up and the trust that could begin in us, between the power of the past and the dawning horizon of the future, between the bystanders who stand around like prison guards and this one who comes toward us and holds out his hand to us. This wavering and trembling between forward and backward, this standing on the spot, caught between horror and expectation, can last a long time. It is a terrible sight, this image of anxiety breaking out in the possessed of Capernaum, the shock, the strangeness, the horror of all others. And yet this moment of crisis is unavoidable. For his healing, the prolonged screaming and shouting of the possessed man is also inevitable. It is essential so that the demons finally drive out the demons. Because if we don't shout and scream out now what has driven us mad, when then? Usually, no one wants to hear this. Not the cries of pain, not the shouts of protest, not the muffled voices from childhood that speak a long disguised language, seemingly disordered, still wild and chaotic. One always thinks it is better to cover one's ears, or even better, to stop up the other person's mouth, or best of all, to close up the source of his heart. In an interpretation of a similar story, the so-called healing of the possessed demoniac in Gerasa, Drewermann makes a reference to Edvard Munch's famous painting that's known as The Scream, or actually that really speaks about anxiety. One closes one's ears to the scream. One always thinks it is better to cover one's ears, or even better to stop up the other person's mouth, or best of all, to close up the source of his heart. But before God, it is not right. And around Jesus, it is not tolerated that people remain at the mercy of their misery in this way. Jesus intervenes here with an incredible determination. This is the first time that he appears in public, and immediately he does so in this absolutely courageous way that categorically calls for decision and liberates to make a decision, literally unlike the scribes. It is the first time that God's word is not just talked about in many phrases, but that human reality changes through speaking of God. For the first time, a person is affected in such a way that any residue of anxiety comes up in him once more, runs through his limbs, and is finally released to the outside. Certainly, in this moment, no easier or simpler course of action would do than the one Jesus feels committed to here. But there's probably nothing more miraculous on earth than to see how humans are able to seize the first chance that ever presents itself to them in their lives, and that with the courage born from despair, they are nevertheless able, despite everything, to seize the hands that are held out to them. No matter how much is heaped on top of the soul of a human being, the first chime of freedom will call it forth, however furtively and covertly. The true language of our being, by whose name God called us when God created us as individuals, as persons, as treasures that exist only once on earth. What does this mean? the people in the synagogue at Capernaum ask. According to the Gospel of Mark, this healing of a possessed person signifies that a totally new time has begun, no more and no less. A new era would begin when people could finally know that they are no ones but God alone. If someone still asks, what is the devil? Or what is devilish? We would have to say, everything that makes people, due to their anxiety, grasp at every straw as if salvation could be found there, even though it actually hands them over to powers that are not God, forces them into a truly demonic counter-logic of creation, through which they are drawn into a process of ever deepening, of ever deeper reaching destruction. But now a choice has to be made between God, who wants us as persons to live our true selves, that God, and the power of anxiety, which compels us to exist, as it were, simply in the collective and phrase our true self to the point of unrecognizability, to the point of destruction, to the point that a person feels so shattered that they begin to believe and speak like in this gospel. I'm too impure to live. I am not a self. I just want to have my peace. We get perhaps closest to the mystery of everything really demonic in humans if we look at it in terms of the idea of purity as a basic attitude characterized by anxiety that simply wants to be completely pure, that wants to make everything completely good and perfect, but that in the end leaves behind nothing but self-negation, self-hatred, and destruction as it is caught in the coercive systems of others. Between the infinite tolerance of God and God's goodness that accompanies all God's creation at every step on the one hand, and the opposing will of a world that is never quite pure enough for the all too pure, for the guardians of the law, for the man with the eternally correct decrees on the other hand. Between these spirits, between these mindsets of spiritual attitudes, one must choose. Because the choice between these two decides what power God has in the hearts of people and how powerless God so often is within the context of a religion that itself consists of too much anxiety. Since that miracle of the healing in the synagogue of Capernaum, a new time has begun, and the decisions have long since been made. And yet, it requires our decisiveness to banish the power and creations of old anxiety. Here ends the interpretation of Drewermann, and I want to highlight one important thing here that we just heard from Drewermann. This idea of a God who wants us as persons in our true self is so counter to the idea of traditional Christian talk of God being against our selfish will. God image that is used to basically say God has to break our will, has to break ourselves. That, Drewermann says, is actually a demonic God image. It is already an image that has been fabricated by fear. It is the image that emerges in Genesis 3 first, after people have become ashamed of their own vulnerability, ashamed of themselves. Drewermann suggests that Jesus is trying to overcome this kind of God image. And this kind of God image is very often represented by the scribes in every religion, by the legalistic theologians, by those who control the behavior of people in the name of God, while demonizing the souls of people. This must stop. And this is the mission of Jesus. This story sets the stage for the whole conflict of Jesus with religious authorities. And this conflict with religious authorities is not with Jewish religious authorities. This is a conflict with religious authorities everywhere. It happens in all religions. And so this is very important to emphasize on this at this point, because even the gospel writers, especially John is in the end, will sort of lump together the religious leaders with the Jews. This has led in Christianity to anti-Semitism, and it's very important that we don't confuse the conflict that's going on here between Jesus and this mindset of literalism and of legalism portrayed in this gospel as having to do with a cultural conflict with a particular kind of religion. This is not what this is at all about. Instead, what Jesus is standing in is the tradition of the prophets of Israel, and Jesus wanted to renew his own religion. Similarly, Drewermann is talking about that we have to get back in touch with Jesus' renewal of his own religion and renew Christianity in a way that debunks all these violent God images and that stops demonizing people. And as we have talked about in this lecture, demonizes people to such a point that it creates a whole business of exorcisms that then reinforce that it is, of course, the theologians and the priests who are the powerful. The end of magic in religion is something that we have to witness here. Jesus is not a miracle worker in the sense of a magician. Instead, the magic, the miracle, is that people learn to trust themselves again, and that people start to believe that God trusts in them, that they're absolutely wonderful as they are. This has massive ramifications across the spectrum in a world today in which religion, again, at a scale that is at times frightening, is used to demonize people. Demonize women for having a choice, demonize women for having a choice, demonize gay and lesbians for experiencing love, demonize now transgender folks for living in sync with who they really feel they are, and so many other forms of demonizing that are all done when people feel truly free, when people feel really they have their own voice. the demonizing of minorities, of people through the lens of racism. There are so many forms in which demonizing happens. The stories in the Gospel of Mark want to cut through the demonizing of all those I have just mentioned, but also of all of us. And Drewermann, in his interpretation here, in his reading of this story, helps us to connect with the parts in us that have not been allowed to live since our childhood, to find our true voice. And so in this spirit, I wish you a good week. I thank you for listening to this lecture. If you liked what you heard, I encourage you to share it. I encourage you to like this video, to subscribe this channel. My goal is to help publish some of these translations of Drewermann's revolutionary way of reading the Bible. And as I said, next week, we will be thinking together about the whole idea that the Bible actually contains a lot of mythic material, that it contains myth, and that does not mean that there's no truth in it. It's a big question, because in our day and age, we think of myth as just like something that has no real truth to it. But actually, Drewermann suggests that myths are very close to poems, to good literature, to even good movies that have a message, and that even though there's nothing historically true to these mythical stories, there are profound human truth in these stories. So stay tuned, and next week again on Friday at 2 o'clock. Thank you.